I wish you didn't smoke weed. You don't have to say
You don't have to say when you smoke.
This is the way it's been since she started smoking pot. She's all lazy and boring.
Who taught you how to do this stuff?
You, all right? I learned it by watching you.
The real action, the pot party, the trippers, the grasshoppers, the hip ones, all gathered in secrecy and flying high as a kite.
Welcome back, Mythheads. This time we're talking about reefer madness and the racist history of marijuana in America.
Hey man, am I driving okay?
According to the United States Drug Enforcement Administration, cannabis, or marijuana, is a Schedule I drug, ranking it among the most dangerous. The DEA states that it categorizes drugs depending on the drug's acceptable medical use and the drug's abuse or dependency potential. Schedule I drugs are the most dangerous, while down at the bottom, Schedule V are considered least dangerous. These Schedule V drugs consist of preparations containing limited quantities of certain narcotics, such as the nerve pain drug Lyrica. Schedule IV narcotics are defined as drugs with low potential for abuse and low risk of dependence. Xanax, Soma, Valium, and Ambien, among others. Xanax has a low potential for abuse. Really?
50 million prescriptions of Xanax written every year by doctors, more than one every second.
The downside, Xanax has a very high potential for dependence and abuse. Very high potential for dependence and abuse.
Schedule III drugs are defined as drugs with a moderate to low potential for dependence. Codeine, ketamine, testosterone, and steroids fall under this grouping. Schedule II drugs are considered to have a high potential for abuse, potentially leading to severe dependence. These drugs, according to the DEA, are considered dangerous. Cocaine, meth, Demerol, Oxycontin, Adderall, and Ritalin are some of the drugs under Schedule II. Finally, we have the baddest of them all, Schedule I narcotics: heroin, acid, peyote, ecstasy, and marijuana.
This is as obvious as night following day. You make more marijuana, more available. You basically say it's not very dangerous and that young people have a right to participate, and others, older people do too. You're going to have more problems.
Wouldn't you agree?
A new study suggests states with easy access to medical marijuana, like Oregon, are seeing fewer opioid usage deaths than other states.
Somehow, someway, the cannabis plant is considered more dangerous than Xanax, cocaine, and meth, and just as dangerous or addictive as ecstasy or heroin. The DEA states that Schedule I drugs are defined as drugs with no currently accepted medical use and high potential for abuse. How can that be the case when within the same country, marijuana on a state level is legal for medical and recreational use in numerous states? The medical uses for marijuana have been proven time and time again, with countless stories of cannabis oil curing seizures and doing all sorts of wonders for people. How can the DEA seriously consider cannabis a Schedule I drug? To get there, we have to look at the bigger picture. Why is cannabis even legal? Long story short, racism. Cannabis wasn't always illegal. Americans were buying cannabis extracts in the 19th century to deal with aches and pains. Its medicinal effects were known even back then, but it was used in other ways as well. In fact, cannabis has many wonderful uses. Hemp is a variety of the cannabis sativa plant which has very low levels of THC and therefore isn't psychoactive. In other words, hemp is weed that doesn't get you high. Instead, it can be used in many, many ways. Hemp can be used as a food source. It can be made into paper, or into a fiber to make clothing with. It can even be used as a building material, as hemp fibers are incredibly durable and strong. Cannabis is a truly versatile plant, so it's no wonder early American colonists grew the stuff, including some of the nation's founding fathers. George Washington grew hemp and wrote about the amazing value of cannabis. Benjamin Franklin owned a paper mill which used hemp fibers. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison were also said to be proponents of hemp. Unfortunately, when marijuana was made legal in the 1930s, hemp went with it. The hidden motive behind making cannabis illegal was racism against new Mexican immigrants. After the Mexican Revolution, displaced Mexicans looked to move north, landing in states like Texas and Louisiana. Many Americans didn't like the idea of Mexicans moving in on quote-unquote their land. Also, the majority of Americans weren't used to consuming cannabis by smoking it as the Mexican immigrants were doing. The fact that marijuana and cannabis are one and the same was lost on most people back then. The Drug Policy Alliance states that the demonization of the cannabis plant was an extension of the demonization of the Mexican immigrants. In an effort to control and keep tabs on these new citizens, El Paso, Texas borrowed a play from San Francisco's playbook, which had outlawed opium decades earlier in an effort to control Chinese immigrants. The idea was to have an excuse to search, detain, and deport Mexican immigrants. That excuse became marijuana. This method of controlling people by controlling their customs was quite successful, so much so that it became a national strategy for keeping certain populations under the watch and control of the government. Between 1916 and 1931, 29 states outlawed marijuana. Eric Schlosser wrote on the topic of reefer madness that police officers in Texas claimed that marijuana incited violent crimes, aroused a lust for blood, and gave its users superhuman strength. Rumors spread that Mexicans were distributing this killer weed to unsuspecting American school children. In 1936, the film known today as Reefer Madness was released.
Oh, here. If you want a good smoke, try one of these.
Marijuana. It causes evidence in time, space.
Let's go, Jack. I'm red hot.
Better be careful how you drive, or the first thing you know, you'll be ice cold. Causes evidence in time, space.
What do you want?
Bring some reefers. Take it easy, kid. It is recommended, Your Honor, that the defendant be placed in an institution for the criminally insane for the rest of his natural life.
Originally titled Tell Your Children, it was one of many anti-weed propaganda films released around the time. The movie further perpetuated the false notion that marijuana is an evil drug that literally made people violently insane. They must have been thinking of alcohol. Anti-weed sentiment was at an all-time high in America during the mid-30s. With the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937, the federal government imposed taxes and penalties, including potential jail time, on commercial cannabis. It essentially killed the entire hemp and cannabis industry, despite objections from the American Medical Association, which argued against making marijuana illegal. There was no real proof that weed made people crazy, but the propaganda and hysteria had already won the battle. Another source of anti-weed propaganda was William Randolph Hearst, an infamous figure of the time. He was a businessman, politician, newspaper publisher, and a known racist. Through the newspapers he owned, Hearst slandered Mexicans and spread fake news about marijuana. Some say Hearst was one of the main people responsible for marijuana prohibition in the 30s, but he only played a part in the whole thing. While he was a newspaper publisher, some people also claim Hearst owned timber holdings and paper mills, but this seems to be false. The idea was popularized by cannabis activist Jack Herer, who claimed Hearst allegedly wanted hemp out as it would mess with his money. According to Skeptoid, however, Hearst as a timber baron appears to be entirely fictional. Though paper suppliers were absolutely among the many industries in which he owned securities, Hearst was a buyer of paper, not a seller. The notion that William Randolph Hearst, the DuPont family, and others all conspired to make marijuana illegal appears to be an urban legend. The real reason for it was indeed racism. As mentioned before, these laws also made it easier for governments to discriminate against certain groups. The Drug Policy Alliance reports that, during hearings on marijuana law in the 1930s, claims were made about marijuana's ability to cause men of color to become violent and solicit sex from white women. This imagery became the backdrop for the Marijuana Tax Act. Associating marijuana with Mexicans and African Americans, then making it illegal, became a tool or a weapon to be used against these minority populations. It made it easier for police officers to stop and detain them with no real other cause. It dehumanized them and made them appear to the greater public as evil, drug-smoking demons who should be cast out of society. Furthermore, politicians use this fear-mongering on the public to gain their trust by promising to get rid of whatever current minority everybody is hating on. It's really sad that this sort of vile tactic is still used today.
They're not sending their best. They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people.
Marijuana Tax Act continued on into the 60s, but in the 70s things changed, and again it was due to racism. Only when these racist laws started affecting white people did the nation take notice.
Police officer, open the door.
It's the grass. It's the bud. Who got down?
What are we gonna do? Watch it.
Whoa, man, let's
By the late 1960s, weed had been taken up by white college students from middle and upper classes. Seeing white lives ruined by marijuana laws altered public attitudes about harsh sentencing. And in 1972, the National Commission on Marijuana and Drug Abuse released a report challenging the approach. As a response, throughout the 70s, many U.S. states softened the penalties for possession. On a federal level, however, things would not change for cannabis. The Marijuana Tax Act was replaced with the Controlled Substances Act. This established a schedule ranking system of the Drug Enforcement Agency. The Nixon administration placed cannabis as a Schedule I drug, and it's been that way ever since. Even though the commission Nixon himself set up declared that cannabis should not be Schedule I, President Nixon discounted the research and kept marijuana ranked among the most dangerous drugs anyway. The ulterior motive for this was once again racism. By attaching marijuana and the drug culture to certain groups, the administration would be able to delegitimize those people. People like the growing anti-war and hippie movements of the 70s, people like the Black Panthers, and people of color in general. This isn't speculation or conspiracy either. In March of 2016, it was revealed that former Nixon aide John Ehrlichman admitted that's exactly what happened, that the war on drugs began as a political tool to silence those opposing the Nixon administration. Journalist Dan Baum interviewed Ehrlichman before the Nixon aide passed away in 1999. The interview came to light in 2016 again when Baum wrote about it in an article for Harper's Magazine. On the topic, Ehrlichman said, "We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news." Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. Although this story did get some media coverage, it seems like it should have been a way bigger deal. Yeah, we all knew Nixon was a crook and a scumbag, but this is irrefutable evidence that the war on drugs was a failure from its inception. It has done way more harm than good, and it continues to ruin lives today. According to the ACLU, over 7 million people were busted for having weed between 2001 and 2010. In 2016 alone, 1.2 million Americans were arrested for possession. All while private prisons lobby to keep cannabis illegal so they can continue to profit from the injustice of locking people up for a harmless plant. The government did not want to make marijuana illegal because they care about your well-being. It was a trick, a lie, a disgusting abuse of public trust, and it was, and still is, racism and oppression at a systemic level. Stay vigilant, people. If you're a new viewer, please consider subscribing and check out some of our other content. Thanks for watching. Peace.